Hello, my friends. This is Katie Taylor, certified child life specialist, and I'm so grateful you're joining me today as I get to talk with Hailey, mom to three in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. Hailey's blended family consists of herself, her husband, and their three children, the youngest of which was diagnosed with infantile spasms at just 6 months old. Before we jump into what it's like to be the wife, mother, parent, caregiver, and full time chair of a communications department at a college, I want you to pay close attention to Hailey as she talks about how much work goes into being to the woman that she is here today with me. She had to put work, effort, and professional tools into being the thriving mom and advocate she is here talking with us. Although she does share that it feels like she's not always thriving. I'd like for you to consider what it would be like if we gave every caregiver an opportunity to have the space to thrive. What if we gave every caregiver the space they needed to breathe, look inward, and rest? As we get into our discussion, we'll also talk about mindfulness and the power of being present, a theme that is often brought up in these podcast episodes. Mindfulness can mean many different things to people, from formal meditation sessions to more integrated approach like mindful eating, or like all of the Once Upon a Gene crew I see that are all out there walking and sharing their pictures on social media. I've also heard someone say they take their mindful moment as they make their coffee. They're really present about how they pour their cup and grind the beans. And if you're like me, listening to Hailey may feel like a form of self care or staying present and giving to yourself. But I'd like for you to look inward at the end of our conversation and see how you could use this episode as a launch pad into investigating what you might need in this present moment. I'm so grateful you're here. Hello, my friends. Welcome to Child Life on Call. This podcast is a safe place for parents to share their stories about what it's like to have a child that has a medical experience, diagnosis, disease, and or everything in between. We know there's power in sharing stories, and that power multiplies when you can listen to other parents who have walked a similar path to yours. Giving and getting advice is great, but hearing how another parent navigates the complexities and nuances of healthcare is even better. As a child life specialist, my role is to support, validate, and provide emotionally safe spaces for kids and their families, and I am so honored to be on this journey with you. In addition to parent stories, we sprinkle in some expert episodes every now and again that have content for both parents and professionals in the field of healthcare, all with the mission to empower parents to be confident advocates and partners with the care team during healthcare experiences. We're so glad you're here. I'm going to drop you into our conversation here, where I was putting together the fact that Hailey is an expert in interpersonal communication. And wow, some of the medical conversations she must have had with providers over the years.
And I teach in the communication program. I mainly teach interpersonal communication, and I am chair of the department there.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm just thinking all of the insight you have when you have medical conversations with medical professionals and being like, let me teach you a little bit about communication.
Yes, I've learned a lot about let's talk about bedside manner here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, gosh, what an interesting career. I love, you mentioned yesterday on your Instagram stories about how often when a diagnosis comes into the family, that one or both caregivers have a change of job,
Mhm.
and that you consider yourself very lucky to continue throughout your passion, but it's not without sacrifices, both from yourself, right, and your employer and
Mhm.
everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when my daughter was first diagnosed, I my immediate went to, well, somebody has to quit their job. Like that's just what
Yeah.
we have to do. How can you continue working and maintaining your life when your child is suffering and seizing and has all of these medical complexities? I mean, just the appointments alone, including therapy,
Right.
take up so much time. And there was kind of I think, yes, we juggle a lot, but I recognize very much the privilege my family has of how kind of the stars aligned for both my spouse and I to continue to be able to work while COVID and the pandemic has been terrible and there's been so much loss. My daughter was diagnosed August of 2020. So still early on, but everybody was working from home and I was able to teach from home. And so everything shifted to online. And even as we've gone back to teach in person, I was fortunate to have an incredibly flexible employer that values me and me as a whole person. So, not just the work I do, but also as a mother and as a parent, and has been incredibly accommodating and basically said, "We want to keep you. What can we do?" And
Wow.
so I am able to go to campus a couple of days a week, but I am also able to stay home and do online courses. And my husband also has a very accommodating employer that doesn't make him do hour for hour for every time he needs to take our daughter to an appointment. And then we've also lucked out in that we live in a state that doesn't take parent income into account. And so, in order to have Medicaid as a backup insurance for my daughter and access disability services and all of the things that that provides, including having paid caregivers that we don't have to pay out of pocket for, we in Oregon, they allow for that, which many states don't. And so we were able to find a really wonderful and qualified caregiver to take care of our daughter because she wouldn't be able to go to daycare. So
Mm.
it really is kind of the stars aligned in so many ways. And so I think on the outside looking in, it can seem like, wow, we're just really good at juggling things. And while we've learned a lot, that is not totally accurate. We have a lot of privilege and a lot of resources that many families don't have access to.
Well, it's just such a beautiful demonstration of what can happen when families are supported and
Hmm.
families are given the tool. And then you have the bandwidth to come and do a podcast like this. Because this isn't an easy, like, you're advocating on top of your job, on top of being a mother and all of the other things that you have going on. And this takes bandwidth too, right? To just sit down and talk with somebody. And so I'm, for one, so grateful to have you kind of share what it has been like for you, how those stars have aligned, and the difference that it can make in just bandwidth and being able to continue to be you, Haley.
Thank you. I think everybody finds, self care is such a loaded word that I think gets tossed around, especially when you have a child with medical complexities. People on the outside always, well, how are you taking care of yourself? What is self care? And I roll my eyes because it's not that easy. When
Yeah.
people say, well, make sure you have a date night, I go, well, are you going to take care of my child who has regular seizures? Like it's not that easy. But one thing that I've found that has been self-care for me is advocacy.
Mhm.
And which I know we'll talk more about. That is not something that everybody feels compelled to do. And I absolutely don't think that is self care for everybody. Talking about your child's trauma on a regular basis can be incredibly triggering. But for me, it's really built community and has helped me. I wouldn't say I'm healed when I say help heal me. There's still a lot
Right.
of a lot of things that
Yeah.
I'm working through, but it has been very cathartic to me to really talk openly about my daughter's diagnosis, but more so the grief that I've experienced. And in turn, has connected me with some amazing families. And so the podcast is for me a way of self care because
Mm.
advocacy has been incredibly helpful for me in coping with really traumatic past 3.5 years.
It resonates with me so much on, the complete flip side in working with families and getting to just see little blips. And then I come and do the podcast and I get to talk with you and I get to see how you're doing now and hear about your resilience. And for me, it's like you go from your job to doing the podcast. And now, again, I'm privileged enough to do Child Life on Call full time and we're doing a number of things, but the podcast has always felt like my self care. Like
Mhm.
I get to continue to build relationships outside of the hospital. There's rules and ethics and all of those boundaries that exist for beautiful reasons. But now I get to follow you on Instagram and learn from you and talk with you. And this feels like self care to me. So I very
Mhm.
much resonate with what you said.
Absolutely. Self care for some people maybe is doing yoga or taking a nap. which I do all of those things too. I need a lot of self-care, but it can also look like advocacy. And so I
Yeah.
think that's really important for people to find even those little moments of what helps them in some way. And I think sometimes medical parents feel guilt if they're not doing advocacy. And
Mm.
I hope they don't feel that way because, again, it's not one size fits all. And again, opening up for me has been really healing, but it's also being very vulnerable and sharing and reflecting and experiencing and reliving that trauma on a regular basis, which is absolutely not right for everybody.
100% of the time. Yes, yes. It doesn't fit for everybody. Well, take us back to kind of the beginning when you were having concerns about some of the movements you saw in Juniper. And I know you took her to the ER and kind of start from there, if you will, about your experience.
Sure. So, up until about 6 months old, we thought we had a air quotes healthy child. Juniper was developing typically, not that a child does a whole lot in the first 6 months, but she actually rolled over at 8 weeks old. And I remember saying, because she's our third child, oh gosh, we're going to have to push her down because we don't want her to be walking yet. We don't want her to be advanced, right? And now I kind of can eye roll and laugh at that in some dark
Yeah.
humor way, which again, dark humor is something that's been very cathartic and healing for me. But we thought everything was fine. She had a normal birth. I had a healthy and typical pregnancy. There were no red flags at all. And then in hindsight, we think that she plateaued in development. So she rolled very early on, and then there was nothing else at that point. So in hindsight, maybe there was some delaying earlier than. But again, when I remember noticing she wasn't really grabbing at things, but she wasn't our first child, and so for me, I'm going, I'm not a paranoid mom. I know kids develop in their own way. My son, I guess, was minorly delayed in crawling, and I remember being so paranoid about that, and now look
Right.
back and roll my eyes that
Yeah.
knowing that kids sometimes are not gonna hit their milestones exactly at 8 months, and he's now only has 1 speed, which is running. So,
Yeah.
I remember those kind of, "Hmm, that's strange, she's not grabbing at things," but I brushed it off as being paranoid. And then at about 6 months old, we noticed that she would wake up from a nap or doze off and wake up, and she would have these jerky body movements. I kind of joke that it almost looked like, a dabbing movement of
Yeah.
what her arms would do because she was laying down. So it's hard to see a jackknife movement in a child and a baby that's not sitting up. She didn't fold in because she was laying down on the ground.
Right.
And what really triggered us is we had her in like a bouncer and she suddenly started crying. And we realized she had collapsed in and hit her head. And we went like, why would you do that? It was kind of bizarre, but we thought, she's 6 months old, figuring out the tone of her body. And what we realize now is that was one of her first seizures when she collapsed down and hit her head on a bouncer. And then from after that, it just progressed. Every time she would wake up, she would have these weird movements. She was a baby that had a lot of reflux. And so it did look like reflux. And I remember even having her 6 month well child exam, and I didn't even bother bringing it up to her pediatrician because, again, I'm like, well, it wasn't super consistent. Sometimes she would have them, sometimes she wouldn't. And she was very refluxy. But pretty much immediately after 6 month well child, they started getting progressively more obvious. And I even have a video, which was, what I always recommend to parents is take a video
Mhm.
because if your child isn't doing a movement regularly and consistently, you have the video to show your provider and your pediatrician to say, this is what I'm concerned about, rather than trying to describe it. And so I took a video, and you can even hear my husband was on the phone, and you can hear him in the background talking to his aunt, seeing my daughter have this movement and going, "Oh, okay, I need to go." Like, you can hear the
Yeah.
concern in his voice. And so at that point, we were like, let's take her to the emergency room, the local one where she was born, not a pediatric hospital, just the local emergency room. And we had multiple providers look at her even while she was doing those movements. And they said, we don't know what this is. It's probably something neurological. And I said, well, should we go to our pediatric hospital, which is up in Portland, about an hour away? And they said, no, just get an appointment with a neurologist at some point. And I knew specialty appointments can take a while. And I said, well,
Yeah.
it could take us months to get in. And they said, yeah, this is not something that's an emergency. We don't know what it is, but it's not going to cause damage. So it's okay. Which now we know is very much not the case. And so they let us go, never admitted us. And in the meantime, my husband was Googling. And I always caution parents with Googling,
Yeah.
but this is one of those cases where it paid off because he found UCLA has a big campaign. They have a big center for infantile spasms, and they had YouTube videos about spasms. And there was a child having spasms. And my husband said, that doesn't this look like Juniper? And it did. And everything we
Yeah.
read said catastrophic, emergency, go to a hospital. And so we got home, packed up our things, and went to the
Went
pediatric
to
hospital
Portland.
up in Portland. And I think it was one resident that took a look at her in the emergency room, and we could just see on his face that this was not nothing. And then we were admitted, hooked up to an EEG, and kind of the rest is history in regards to her diagnosis.
Wow. That's probably so much to unpack, but and I agree with the Google thing. I've had multiple parents have different ways of doing it. One is
Mhm.
like they ask like a family friend to Google and then like report back so they're not the one doing it
Yes.
themselves, or like you guys, like the one of the partners does it, or
Mhm.
you do it and you're not in a state of crisis but you're ready to like actually consume and go through the information or talk to other parents. But it sounds like it was the right thing for sure and got you to Portland.
It's such a double-edged sword because when you Google infantile spasms, there is no good things that come
No.
up, and it's such a spectrum diagnosis. There are so many outcomes, when you have a diagnosis of infantile spasms. I always say it's a symptom of something else. So I describe it as if you have a sore throat, there could be a million reasons why you have a sore throat. You could have a cold, you could have the flu, you could have strep throat, you could be allergic to cats, right?
Yeah.
At the sore throat is not necessarily the diagnosis, but it points you to something else, a symptom. And infantile spasms and epilepsy in general, which I think is often very misunderstood. Seizures and epilepsy and spasms are a symptom of another diagnosis. And it could be genetic, it could be a brain malformation, it could be an infection, it could be a traumatic brain injury that happened in utero or soon after. And so when you Google infantile spasms, you see these statistics and all this information. And it's important and helped us get a diagnosis. The videos are really important, but it doesn't really tell you the outcome for your child because you don't have a true underlying cause at that point when you receive a diagnosis typically.
You're so well spoken and such an incredible advocate about that. I can see why you continue to speak out about being a parent with a child who has infantile spasms. Have you always been that way? Did you kind of find yourself when you got to Portland, or did you have any moments of fight or flight, or what were you going through at the beginning, and then how have you evolved since then?
Sure. So, no, I have not always been that way. I am someone that wants to gather all of the information, and that's something that's been very different compared to my spouse. So, I mean, that's a whole other topic, but I think partners that have a medically complex child tend to handle things very differently, and we handled it very differently. I wanted all of the information. I wanted to connect to the communities and the Facebook groups and everything right away. I feel like I'd rather know everything and
Mhm.
then maybe catastrophize, and then maybe if it doesn't turn out that way, great, right?
Yeah.
Whereas my husband will admit he was in denial for a very long time. I think we both were. I hoped that Juniper would be a best case scenario. And in fact, the attending physician that we saw thought Juniper would be too. He has since apologized and said,
Mm.
which I commend him for. He said, "I never should have told you. I thought Juniper would be okay. I shouldn't tell that to any parent because we don't know." But
Wow.
she presented, air quotes again, so well and had no red flags up to that point. We really got told for a year by multiple different physicians that, she didn't fit the bill of what a child who was diagnosed so early would present as. And so I had a lot of hope, and my husband had even more. We would joke that, gosh, won't this be a great motivational statement when she's applying for college about what she's overcome? Because we had in our mind she would be okay. Right. And I think
Yeah.
all parents should have hope, but hope can also be really damaging. It's this balance. That being said, I think I was much more aware of the spectrum of outcomes and the statistical likelihood. 80% of kids with infantile spasms are not going to end up okay. And I had this feeling that that's maybe where she would fall. And maybe that's because I am not an optimist and my
Mhm.
husband is, but he really thought she would be diagnosed, she'd get the steroid treatment, she'd be fine, he'd be back to work, I'd be back to work, and we'd carry on. And
Yeah.
that was not the case. And so for me, gathering information and coming to terms has taken some time, but it also has empowered me. The advocacy piece has empowered me because for me, my driver has always been I want to make my daughter's life the best it can possibly be. And one way to do that is by educating, especially people not in the disability community, to be kind, to be kinder, to correct misconceptions. If I can make the world a bit kinder for my daughter, then her life will be better. And then I've done my job as a parent. And I think that's really hard because it took me a while to come to terms that I can't cure my daughter. I've done everything I can. We've done brain surgery. We've tried over a dozen medications. We've done everything we possibly could. And my daughter is still not okay. She still has daily seizures and she is still has global disabilities, physical and intellectual. And so I think it's very easy, especially as a mother, to blame yourself and to question, could you have done something different? And through a lot of therapy, I've realized, no, I've done everything I could. And sometimes things are just out of your hands. So if I can't cure her, I'm going to make the world a little better, which is a big
Mm.
task to do. But that's what continues to motivate me. I can't take her seizures away, but I can continue to do research, I can continue to advocate and educate, and I can continue to try and make her life as joyful as it can possibly be.
Mm. You're absolutely doing that. What are if you don't wanna talk about this, I completely respect it. What was your moment that you thought, "I deserve help too. Like, it's time for me to get some
Mhm.
therapy." Was it something you saw in yourself? Was it friends and family speaking up? What was it for you?
Yeah, and I am very vocal about this. I am happy to share because I think that there's still such a stigma around therapy and antidepressants and all of these things. I have a history of situational depression and anxiety even prior to my daughter. With my son, I had really severe postpartum. And so darkly ironically, with my daughter, I didn't have postpartum with her. I was like, this is my last kid. I'm going to enjoy this baby phase. I'm going to like give myself a break. And, the world had different plans and
Yeah.
threw me for a loop. And so I think accessing support is something that I was already accepting of. That being said, it took me a while because I think early on, you get people saying, "Are you going to therapy? Are you doing these things?" And you're in such survival mode that I knew this I need to do this. I need to take care of myself, but I can't right now because my priority was helping my daughter, helping my other kids, doing my actual work job. It was not taking care of myself.
Yeah.
And we did have blips of seizure control in the beginning, and then I think the big moment for me, so right after her first birthday, We were actually in the hospital down in California during her first birthday, and it was peak COVID. So I was alone with my daughter. My husband was in a hotel 2 blocks away because it was a one parent rule, hard and fast. And so he celebrated her birthday via FaceTime while she was hooked up to an EEG. And then 4 days after her birthday, she had a hemispherectomy, which means they actually removed the entire right side of her brain in an attempt to cure her. I mean,
Yeah.
pediatric epilepsy surgery can be curative, which
Right.
is one of the only ways to actually cure epilepsy. And she was given a very high likelihood of having seizure freedom. So I think over an 80% chance
Wow.
because of the brain malformation that she had. So you remove it, we knew we were going to have profound disabilities, but profound disabilities was better than possibly dying of seizures from
Mhm.
SUDEP. And she had the surgery, lots of trauma in that hospital, but she had the surgery. We got home about 3 weeks later, her seizures returned. And that, I think, was my absolute lowest moment. Her
Yeah.
diagnosis was hard, but I think that moment when her seizures returned and her home team, I can't say enough good things about her epileptologist in Portland. He delivered some very difficult news in such a positive and kind and caring way. But that moment and the months following was absolutely my lowest point because it hit me. I couldn't cure my daughter. I couldn't change it. And up until that point, I thought I could cure her. And I didn't want to get out of bed. I didn't want to work. I didn't even want to hold Juniper because I felt so broken when I would see her. And there was a moment where I remember my husband took me aside and he said, I can't take care of you and take care of Juniper and take care of our other kids. I need you to take care of yourself and get help. And he was crying at that point, like, I need you to help yourself because I need help. And he is great. And he started looking up therapy. And I knew like talk therapy wouldn't quite do it for me because I'm a very
Yeah.
reflective person. And I
You're
was
in
far
communications. Yeah.
yeah, I was far past where I knew why I was sad. I knew all of these things. What I needed help with was the trauma and the guilt. I felt like in an attempt to save my daughter with brain surgery, I made her life worse. And I was the one that signed that paper to bring her back to surgery. And I made her life. She was profoundly disabled because it disconnected half her body. So she has cerebral palsy on her left side of her body, and she has daily seizures. And so I felt like I destroyed my daughter's life, me, not my husband, not the medical providers, me, right? So I needed trauma therapy. And so I actually pursued EMDR, which is a very different type of therapy, but it's trauma focused. And at first, because I'm used to talk therapy, I'm like, what is this crazy stuff?
Yeah.
But it really gets at the root of where your trauma come from and actually kind of reprograms how you process things when you're triggered. And I think that's what really saved me, and antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication. But that key moment was my husband really looking at me and saying, I can't do this alone. And basically saying, I will admit you into a psychiatric hospital. We will pay for where the celebrities go to get rehab. I don't care. We will send you away if we need to, if that's what will help, but I need you to be okay.
Yeah. I bet that was really hard for him to get the courage to say that, and how amazing it was that you said yes and you
Mhm.
decided to do it.
Mhm.
I've done EMDR myself also on anti-anxiety, antidepressant, and I can't say enough good things about it too, and
Yes.
how different it can be and not what you expect, and not easy either, not easy.
Not easy. I mean, it was a year of weekly or biweekly therapies for me. And
Mhm.
I can't say enough, especially if there's a very key for me, the very key trauma moment was that time spent in the hospital and handing her over and signing that paper and feeling like it was my fault that it didn't work. And so I still sometimes cycle back to those moments.
Right.
Her hemispherectomy anniversary is coming
Right.
up and it sends me spiraling. But I learned skills to be able to pull myself out of those spirals. So it doesn't get rid of the trauma, but it has allowed me to have resources when I see myself falling into that pit of being
Mm.
able to climb out, which was something I couldn't do previously.
To move through it rather than let it, control
Yeah.
you. You're very impressive. I think you're pretty amazing.
Thank you.
We talked before this started about what I've heard from parents over the past 200 episodes. And one of the themes that emerged was this perspective that comes with being fully present and mindful of what's going on. And I
Mhm,
immediately thought of you and Juniper because of the constant seizures,
mhm,
and that you have to constantly have this awareness and presence of mind to tend to them. What medication are we on? What's happening? Who's with her? How is she sitting? How
mhm,
have you seen being present and being mindful in the moment impact your experience?
mhm. I think it's very difficult when you have a child that is experiencing a traumatic event on a regular basis. For Juniper, that looks like seizures, but there's children who have respiratory distress or have cardiac events or other things that it's not just one traumatic moment that then you're working on moving on from that. It's a daily or weekly or even monthly experience that you're having to relive that trauma. Currently, Juniper has, probably 2 to 4 seizures every single day. What I will say, and I never wanna minimize spasms because they are awful little demons. However, her seizure type, she primarily has spasms. She does have some tonic seizures. They do not, at this point, impact her breathing. And so we rarely have had to give rescue medications. And I know many families who experience children that have respiratory distress and have to give rescue meds almost every single day. And so I want to make sure I emphasize that because no seizures are good seizures, but I really feel for the families that have to worry with each seizure that this may be the one where they lose their child. That being said, again, no seizure is a good seizure,
Right.
and we experience them daily. And she has had seizures every single day, multiple times a day, for about 3 years. And that is hard. And I think that's important to emphasize that it's hard. I think one thing that I've done is I try to stay present, but also disconnect. So my husband
Mm.
also does. He sings Hakuna Matata to her during her
Yeah,
seizures. I don't know why, but that's his thing. He'll turn to her and just start singing Hakuna Matata and he'll just sing. And I think that's his way to kind of disconnect,
uh-huh.
but still staying present. For me, I will kind of rub her stomach, I'll play with her hair, I'll do things to try and not focus on the seizure, but that's a very difficult thing to do. I think the biggest challenge is after, especially if she has a particularly long or intense one where we do have to give medications, jumping back into life. I mean, I have 2 other children, and
Yeah.
so there are moments where I'm giving my daughter a rescue medication, and then I have to go take my son to soccer practice. And it's this weird, I think, dichotomy where people go, "Ho how is that possible?" Like, it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't. It
It
doesn't make sense
doesn't.
that you can go through something traumatic, and then you take your child to soccer practice, or you go
Yeah,
cook dinner, or I go back to grading essays of my students. And some days I am better than that than others. I think I in the first year was particularly terrible. I would shut down after that. But I realize, my motivator is my kids. my motivator especially is her brothers, that I want them, they know about her seizures, they've seen her have seizures, but I want them to still be kids, and I want Juniper to
Yeah.
still be kids. And I remember at one point, this other medical parent who I have become very good friends with said, "Don't miss out on your daughter's life. Don't miss out on her being a baby, on being a toddler." And I think the first year I did, I was so consumed with her seizures and focused on those. I let absolute epilepsy rule our life. I let her diagnosis rule our life. And so I couldn't even be present for her or for her brothers. And so it's again taken a lot of therapy, a lot of this is a moment that is bad and awful, and then we take that moment, we push it aside, and we continue on. I
Mm.
don't want epilepsy to rule our lives. I want us to be in charge of our lives. Epilepsy is a terrible disease, right? But it is not going to control us. And I think that's how I've worked on my healing, is just being stubborn and saying this does not get to control our lives. My children still get to be children. My daughter still gets to do things. My son still gets to go to soccer practice. My other son still gets to go swimming. And we're going to do that. And sometimes that is easier said than done. And there are still days where I crumble afterwards. And I give
Right.
myself grace to do that.
Yeah. What are some of your favorite parts about being Juniper's mom?
Mm. Oh gosh, I think that she is just the most amazing human I have ever met. I will not even say child, human. She is the most
Mm.
amazing human I have ever met. This girl has been dealt so much in her life and has been poked and prodded than most adults will ever experience. And yet, anyone who meets her just sees she exudes joy.
Mhm.
She rarely cries. She loves people. She would be happiest if she just snuggled up to someone all day long. And also, she has such a big personality. I think that's something, admittedly, I was very unaware of prior to my daughter. I was very unfamiliar with disability, especially
Right.
intellectual disability. And Juniper and so many of her peers have the biggest personality. You just have to not compare them to neurotypical children and neurotypical kids. She is so stubborn. She is manipulative. She is sassy.
I
She has
love it.
very strong opinions, but she doesn't speak. And so you have to be present with who the child is and not compare, and you will learn so much. And so, again, while I never say like I needed to learn anything from her diagnosis, I'm never one for silver linings. I will say my daughter has taught me so much. And I am so grateful for her. I would take away the epilepsy if I could, but the disability is part of who she is. She was always meant to be this way. And I think she is a hilarious, quirky, sassy little girl.
Oh my gosh, I love that. You're so well spoken, and I just think you should be on every single, what's the word, grand rounds, in every hospital should get to meet you and talk with you, because I feel your advocacy. I feel Juniper, I feel your sons, your entire experience. Selfishly, because you're so good at speaking, what do you want from healthcare workers as soon as you walk into the hospital? I want to know for myself and for the people I
Yeah.
work with, when you walk in, what can we do to
Mhm.
make things better, easier, better transitions? What does that look like?
Yeah, I think that, we've been fortunate in that we have had really good medical providers. We've had a few blips here and there that have
Yeah.
not been so great, but for the most part, we have had really wonderful medical providers who have been really understanding and willing to learn. And I think that is the biggest thing, is willing to learn from the parents. Most medical providers see children and families in one moment, or and they see many at the same time. And so, I think we've had a few situations where medical providers, I think, have tried to get us to a place of acceptance before we were ready. or they minimize what we're experiencing. They may see seizures every single day and recognize that a kid can still have a beautiful life, and they try to instill that on us of like that silver lining. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. You can still do these things, right? To rush us through the process. And I
Mm,
think instead recognizing our whole world exploded. My world exploded the day I received my daughter's diagnosis. Every dream, every plan I had exploded. And yes, like we just put her in ballet last weekend. Like there is a way to still do things. There is still a way to have family trips and do activities. And I still love my daughter and she is amazing. But there's still grief involved in the process. And I think there's this stigma, especially in the medical parent of children with disability community, where if we vocalize that we're grieving the life that we wanted, it's like we are saying we don't love and accept our child for who we are, that we are ableist, right? And I am very big on the power of the word and, that two contradictory feelings can exist in the same moment. So, for example, I can love my child. I think she is amazing and phenomenal. And I can grieve what will no longer be and what I had hoped and wanted when I found out that I was having a little girl, especially after having two boys. Maybe she would never want to go to prom. Maybe she would
right,
never want to have mom daughter nail pedicure nights. Right. But that would be her choice. And
right.
this choice was taken away. And so
It
I don't
was.
grieve my daughter. I grieve the life that I had wanted. And I would like more medical providers to be aware that it's going to take time, support us in that moment, give us resources, but we're going to grieve the life that we wanted and thought we would have.
Absolutely. That's such good, amazing perspective. And something that whether you're at the registration, you're the one doing labs, you're the one on the phone on the Medicaid company, need
Mhm.
to carry with us as it's so true. And kind of selfishly what I was saying is in the hospital, I see families for one blip. What I want to know is there were so many moments leading up to this exact time that we have to take into account. And we can't just do things the way we've always done because they worked a few times. We have to
Mhm.
ask the parent, what works now? What's the best thing to do? You know her best. So I will continue to advocate for that. And medical
Mhm.
professionals continue to do that.
Mhm. Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
I know you're so active and just beautifully spoken about your experience. Where can people follow along with you, learn more about infantile spasms, and maybe see some cute pictures of you guys?
Sure. Yeah. So we're me are very active on Instagram. So I'm sure you can link the Instagram handle, but it's very easy to remember. It's just growing underscore juniper. And while it appears to be an account about juniper, it very much is much more an account about kind of a personal blog. Writing has always been very cathartic for me. So it's much more morphed into my journey, my grief, my growth as a medical parent. I think one thing that in hindsight I've learned that I felt like really lacked early on in her diagnosis is I immediately would go onto the Facebook groups and look for stories of hope. But hope to me in that moment looked like a child who was fine. And what I needed and what maybe I didn't realize I needed, but now know is how beneficial those stories of the child did not have the ideal outcome, but my daughter is still hopeful. I had a parent actually reach out to me the other week when I shared about Juniper doing ballet in a wheelchair for the first time. And she is about a year into her child's diagnosis and said, seeing Juniper do ballet was one of the first times that I felt like I can do this life. Like, this is gonna be
Yeah.
hard, it's going to look different, but I can still have those moments of joy. And so if you follow along, it is much more about me processing things and experiencing the world alongside Juniper. The other way is I did write a book about pediatric epilepsy It's called What is Epilepsy? A simple explanation of a complex diagnosis. And it is a children's
Mm.
book. And it's motivated by my son and how I talk to my kids. It has scientific terminology, everything from what epilepsy is to how it's diagnosed to the potential causes, as well as the impact on disabilities. And it's been well received. It's how I like to share about what epilepsy is because I think knowledge is really powerful. And what I've seen is when kids understand why my daughter is nonverbal, why she's not talking, why seizures happen, why she's not walking, they're much more simple than adults and go, huh, all right, that makes sense. And then they move on and they embrace her. They just want to know why.
Right.
And so that's another resource available.
I love that. Okay, I'm gonna have to read your book. I haven't read it yet, and
Yeah.
then we'll share it absolutely when child life specialists, we're always sharing book recommendations. So I will have
Yeah.
to read that. So tell your son, thank you for inspiring this
Yes.
beautiful book for his sister.
Yeah, no, he was great. He started to notice in 1st grade, he came home and we were sitting giving Juniper a bath, and he said, "When Juniper's 3, will she be like other 3-year-olds?" And I
Mm.
said, "Well, what do you mean by other 3-year-olds?" Knowing what he meant. And he said, "Well, will she be able to talk and walk?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Sometimes I feel sad. I still love Juniper, but I feel sad that she doesn't run up to me after school like my friends' brothers and sisters do." And I said, "That is sad and that is hard. And you can love Juniper and still feel sad." And he was feeling like he needed a way to talk to his friends about why his sister can't do those things. So he absolutely was the
Wow.
inspiration for the book. And I think while it's wonderful for children and families impacted by epilepsy, I think it's been especially wonderful for siblings who have brothers or sisters that are diagnosed with epilepsy and have profound disabilities as a result of it.
Well, Haley, thank you so much for your constant work and your brainstorming and your gap filling and sharing on Instagram what you wish you could see when you get on there, because I think it just comes across so incredibly beautiful and authentic and real and not always easy. And that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, I am not one for silver linings. So
Yeah.
so if
I,
you want silver linings, don't necessarily follow. I think both can exist, right? It is
yeah.
hard. This life is
Mm.
hard. And there are a lot of moments of joy that I did not think 3.5 years ago could possibly exist.
Thank you so much for staying with us as we got to talk with Haley today. If you're not already, whether you're a parent or a professional, please follow us on Instagram. That's where we do a lot of our talking with the community, sharing of free resources, and all the good stuff. Thank you all so much, and I will see you here next week.